Good day, everybody, and thank you very much for joining today's webinar about project configuration best practices for your Rollbar accounts and your Rollbar projects. We are super happy that everybody can join us today. If, however, you have colleagues or friends who want to watch this, we will be recording this session, as you can see over here as well. So feel free to mute yourself, as well as turn those cameras off if you don't want to be recorded. And if you have any questions, as we mentioned, please feel free to add them to the chat window. We'll go ahead and answer them during the end of the session with our Q&A session. Perfect. So for many of you already use Rollbar, and hopefully you enjoy using Rollbar every day. And hopefully as you use Rollbar, you can see that our mission, which is on screen, is really something that resonates in everything we do, which is really to help you as a developer build software quickly and painlessly. And hopefully Rollbar is helping you to do that every day as we help you identify when things go wrong and how you can get to the root cause of fixing those things very, very quickly versus struggling through finding them, figuring out what's wrong, and then fixing them. Now, during today's session, it'll be myself, Nico Kruger. I also have Finbar Fleming, who's going to be with me today. And we work with a lot of our customers here at Rollbar day in and day out about best practices for Rollbar. We help them implement Rollbar, set up the SDKs, help them solve some of those easy problems and also some of those more complex problems. So we're looking forward to running through some of the best practices we've encountered and learned through the years of working with Rollbar. And hopefully we can pass those on to you and you can get even better at using Rollbar every single day. So Finbar, let's go ahead and jump in. So for today's agenda, we'll be covering project basics. So these are the basics of setting up a Rollbar project. And as we go through all the various setup parts of Rollbar projects specifically, we'll be covering what are those best practice things you should be doing and why you should be doing some of those things as you're changing these settings or setting those up. And then finally, we'll show you how you could do this in an automated fashion. So a lot of these things you can do as far as manual setups and create some of these project settings, configure them. But how do we scale this? How do we do this for hundreds and hundreds of Rollbar projects created every day? And we do have customers that do that, and we'll share with you how they're doing that and how they actually automate that process start to finish with Rollbar. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And again, if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put it into the chat as well. So the first question we get very, very often is, what is a Rollbar project? And it's a very good question. And in Rollbar's world, if you think of a Rollbar account, you have a Rollbar account that you log onto. That account has many Rollbar projects. And a project is, think of it as a deployable or, releasable piece of code, an application or service. So if you think of a Git repository, one Git repository typically equals a Rollbar project. And inside of that Rollbar project, you would have environments. And typically these would be not hundreds or thousands of environments. They'd really be things like your production, your test, and your dev environment. So actual environments you typically would have in whatever piece of code you're deploying and wherever you're testing on. So think of a Rollbar project as you can have as many projects as you like, and that project typically matches a Git repository or releasable app that you might be working on. So a good example would be you might have a front-end app, you might have some back-end services, which might be individual Rollbar projects. Your mobile iOS app might also be a Rollbar project, and so on and so on. So think of them that way. It is also very important, if you do set them up that way, that some of the integrations into, for example, GitHub for your source control, also for issue management tools, will make a lot more sense. And we'll show you how some of these other settings will actually work a lot better if you set Rollbar up in this fashion. So let's go ahead and jump in at the very, very beginning. So first, we're going to cover project setup. So these are your general setup things like the project name, which you set up when you create a project, but also what are members, users, teams, access tokens, what about deployments, environments, and custom fingerprints. So let's jump into teams. Now, the first thing to note about Rollbar is this concept of a Rollbar account. And typically a Rollbar account is an organization, or your company would have an account, a Rollbar account, and you would join into that account. Okay, so inside of a Rollbar account, you would have this concept of what we call team members, so users or team members, and these people or users would be placed inside of teams. So in Rollbar, we have this concept of a team. Now, when you create a brand new Rollbar account, you have two default teams. The first is the owners group, which is your administrator. So these are individuals who can own and manage the account. Best practice here to have multiple people. In many instances, we see accounts where you have only one owner and that person leaves or changes a job, and then you have a bit of a problem because nobody can manage that account, change certain settings, which only the owners can do. So best practice is to have 2 or 3 people set up as the owners of your Rollbar account. And then, of course, all other users typically would go into the everyone teams bucket. Now, what we recommend is that you actually create teams. So a basic example would be you'd have a QA team, a dev team. You might have, if you're a very large organization, many teams that work together. So think of 6 or 7 people working as a team. You could create a Rollbar team that mimics them. And they would have various access levels. So think of the 3 access levels we have, which is standard, which is your default permission set. So you can work on errors, you can assign them, do most of the things you would typically as a user want to do in Rollbar. If you think of a light permission set, you can still look at items, control some notifications, but you can't change critical settings. So some of like rate limit settings or notification settings, you won't have access to. So that might be another level depending on the types of users you have. And then finally, the view level is essentially if you've got read-only users. So people you just want to share a Rollbar account with, which might be certain team members, but you don't want them to edit things or change things, go ahead and set them into the view group. Now, one of the important things to note about a Rollbar user is the user, owns the individual account, much like a GitHub repo. So again, in Rollbar, because your user is quite important, you can actually belong to multiple Rollbar accounts. So imagine you do work for multiple companies and each company has their own Rollbar account. Nico, the user that I am, can actually be the same user in all of these accounts. And this is something very unique that you can switch between accounts if you want to. So for example, many organizations would, go ahead and acquire somebody else if they have Rollbar as well. You can switch those accounts that way, but also you can actually transfer projects between accounts. So again, it makes it very easy to do that process because a user can have access to multiple Rollbar accounts if they are given that access. Now, one of the things we highly recommend as a best practice for all users and security is not only to enable the 2-factor authentication inside of Rollbar. If you don't want to do that, we recommend using skim provisioning. So that is connecting with systems like Okta, OneLogin, Google, Azure, any of those systems which support, for example, SAML, and then automatic user provisioning. So that when a user is created in, for example, Okta in a specific team, that is automatically synchronized into Rollbar, and that user can log on. When they leave the company and their permission is removed from Okta, they will automatically be removed from Rollbar. And this is a great way to actually manage large sets of users inside of a Rollbar account. And we highly recommend that as a best practice. It solves many compliance headaches that often creep up with users left in accounts. So if you can set up automatic user provisioning, we highly recommend that for your Rollbar organization's account as well. The next one is project access tokens. Now, for many of you, you'd be familiar with a project access token. When you set up Rollbar for the first time, you set up a project, and a project has access tokens. Now, you can create your own access tokens. Now, by default, we give you 4. There's a post client, server, a read, and a write token. So let's start at the top. What is a client token? That is for client side. So if I'm doing browser.js or some client side SDK, like the JavaScript ones typically, I will use the post client item token. And so errors and messages that come in will use that token. So a good example would be like the browser, client, Android, iOS, and so on. So front end type languages and frameworks. Post server is used for your backend. So if you're doing some Java, if you're doing some .NET, if you're doing any types of backend language, so your APIs, your controllers, they will typically use the server post token. Now, if you want to use the APIs in Rollbar, you could use the read and write tokens to go ahead and query. For example, all your get commands will need at least a read scope for that token. And of course, write, if you want to write back to the API, you will need a write token. Now, one of the things we highly recommend as a best practice is cycling your access tokens. So a Rollbar token by default can live forever. You don't ever have to change it. But best practice, we highly recommend once a month, once a quarter, whatever your security teams recommend, cycle out your tokens. It is best practice to ensure that if a token does get exposed, or just in general best practice, that you can cycle these tokens out. And of course, any SDK that you might have that uses the old token, that will no longer be able to report data. So be careful if you do cycle those out. If you have a legacy app running in, iOS app or Android app that's physically downloaded, and they have embedded in them a Rollbar SDK with an old token, that will stop that item being able, or app being able to report data to Rollbar. So be careful, but we do recommend cycling through these tokens at a regular basis, or at least as your internal organization security preferences would dictate. Now, the next part is token rate limits. So in Rollbar, you would see, for example, this concept on a token of a rate limit. And you'll see two things, a system and a user rate limit. A system rate limit is what we as Rollbar set on accounts. So as soon as you create a brand new project in Rollbar, the default rate limit is 50,000 requests in a minute. Now, we can change that up and down as our system needs to. Typically, it will just stay that way. User rate limits are what you control on your side. So if you have a large spike in traffic or a problem and you know what it is, but you just want to stop some of these errors coming into Rollbar, you can set a rate limit on that token. Many times we highly recommend for different environments creating different access tokens. So remember, you have a Rollbar project, a project has access tokens. Let's say, for example, you have a dev, a QA environment. Use your access tokens for different environments, highly recommended. Have a different token for production. And we recommend if you're in dev and QA, maybe you want to rate limit there. Don't rate limit in production so you can get all the errors that your users are running into. And finally, a note on rate limits, the lowest number wins. If the system rate limit is 50,000 and you set 100,000 in 1 minute, the lowest one wins, so the system one wins. If you set your user rate limit to 500 in 1 minute, your rate limit will win. So the lowest number will always win when it comes to rate limits. Again, use them wisely. They are super powerful. If you do want to sample data, you could use rate limits to help you sample specific tokens and only get a certain set of number of errors throughout the certain minute or hour or day. Perfect. Let's move on to the next one, deploys. Now, we recommend for all Rollbar users, if you're using Rollbar, you want to know about deployments happening in your environment. So integrate Rollbar into your CI/CD pipeline. What do we mean by that? So for example, I use GitHub and GitHub Actions. Whenever I commit my code and the deploy happens, Rollbar is automatically notified via a GitHub action. Now, you might be using different CI/CD tools and different pipeline tools, but they all will support the ability to notify Rollbar of a deployment that is happening. So for example, Bitbucket pipeline, Circle CI, and many, many more. What are the advantages of this, and why should you be doing this as a best practice? The first thing to note is what is really nice about this is, A, when a deployment happens, Rollbar is notified. So you will get an entry that says, hey, this deployment just happened. And all errors or warnings of things that happen after that is actually displayed in such a way, as you can see at my bottom screenshot there. So I know all the new errors that are now happening after this deploy. And even better is you can look at these deploy histories and see errors associated with these commits. And we'll go into setting up your source control environments with this. So connecting your git commit shards with the code in Rollbar so you can identify what code is causing the problem. But this is a great way to identify a specific deploy, and then if there's an increase or decrease in errors, so you can quickly narrow down when the problem was introduced and what to focus on. The next one is environments. Now, we spoke about environments, things like QA, production, testing, and so on. Now, what you can do is oftentimes you have too many environments in Rollbar. You actually have a setting in your project settings where you can hide certain environments. What we also see often happen is somebody is testing out the SDK and they put a random piece of text in the environment because it's a string value, and now that's living in your environment dropdown in Rollbar forever. The good news is you can turn these off. So if you no longer use any specific environments or somebody put them in by mistake, you can easily go and hide the visibility of these. We highly recommend this because it cleans up a lot of your filter views in Rollbar, so it makes it easier for Rollbar users to see what's going on within the project, especially if they want to filter with environments. Now, again, if you have thousands and thousands of environments, like, for example, we would often see environments, so the US production, Europe production, APAC production, you're probably not using environments correctly. So best practice is make those projects, and environments are really that specific environment. If it is a specific Kubernetes instance or cluster, you actually send that in as a custom payload item into the payload data as a custom field, and you can actually filter on that. So don't always use environments for that. You have other mechanisms in Rollbar that you can actually use for that as well. And then custom fingerprinting. So for many of you, you would just by default trust Rollbar to do the fingerprinting, and we recommend that as best practice. We will actually always learn new fingerprint rules and update them in the background for you automatically. But if you ever want to create a custom fingerprint rule, you can do so inside of Rollbar's project settings as well. And simply what this does, it tells Rollbar that you want to group a specific set of items together. So if you don't like Rollbar's grouping for whatever reason, or the way it's grouping some of your errors, we recommend going into the GUI, selecting those items, top right-hand menu, clicking the merge, and that'll actually create some of these rules for you automatically. And again, if you want to do something more custom, this is where you would go ahead and set it up. Now, we're not going to go into detail today of how you create all these fingerprints, because that is probably a webinar on its own, but we do have plenty of documentation that can help you on this as well. And here's an example of one of these custom fingerprints. So if you ever do want to create one, here you can sort of see we have conditions, what conditions should be met. And again, that then creates a fingerprint, and it's an example of what the title will look like in Rollbar. So again, we have plenty of examples of these custom fingerprints, and we're happy to assist you if you do have any questions on how you can set them up. We do recommend being very, very careful of setting up too many custom fingerprints. We often run into teams which they don't understand why things are grouping the way they do, and more often than not, it is because of somebody creating a custom fingerprint rule for one instance, and that then causes other things to go wrong in the grouping, because essentially you're telling Rollbar, I want to change the default behavior. So best practice is keep these as low as possible. Let Rollbar do them. If you find something you don't like, merge them in the GUI, and we'll actually do the hard work for you by creating some of these fingerprints for you as well. Perfect. The next one is integrations. And Finbar, I'll turn it over to you for the integrations.
So thank you very much. Yeah, so in this section here, we're just going to go through the integration section of the project settings, and I'm going to cover source control, notifications, and service links. So to begin with, the first integration I want to talk about is source control, and it's very easy to set up. A couple of things just to be aware of. Often you will be deploying from a particular branch. You can configure part of your source control setting to tell Rollbar which branch to look at. You may be set up in a way so that your code doesn't start at the root of the particular repo that you're connected to, and you can inform Rollbar in your settings what the root folder is for your particular code base. The benefit of the source control integration, and the reason you want to do it, is that when you have it configured, and we support all the Git source control systems, is that you get additional context for each frame of the stack trace that's in your code base. So it allows you to very quickly see the surrounding lines of code without having to open up your editor. For people who maybe don't have easy access to a particular area of the code base, often they can learn more information about the root cause of the problem without actually having to download and view the code in the actual code editor. Another benefit is that you can link out to the files in your source control repo. And specifically in the case of GitHub, we have use the git blame API to pull in the information about who last made the change to each of the frames in the stack trace. From the standpoint of deployments, so if you're also notifying Rollbar of deployments, by having the source control integration, you get the commits between the deployment that you're looking at, the most recent deployment, and the immediately preceding deployment. So you can very quickly see the code commits or the code changes that have probably introduced the error that you're looking at. So we're going to move on and we look at the notification section. And there are four main types. Really, the first one would be messaging systems, so things like email or Slack, so that for a particular type of error or for particular criteria, you want a particular email list or a particular Slack channel notified. The next type of notification that we support are bug tracking systems. So you can think of things like Jira, Shortcut, etc. They have slightly different use cases than messaging. Obviously, the use case is that you're opening a ticket in a ticketing system. One thing to be aware of with specifically around the bug tracking systems integrations is that as soon as you have it configured, you will also get a button that will appear at the item level. So when you're viewing an item and reviewing an error and triaging it, there will be a button that will be available to you to then manually open the ticket in Jira or Shortcut. What you can do is that you can configure the bug tracking notification with none of the automation rules configured and still get that button, so that even though you're not automatically opening tickets in a ticketing system, you have an easy mechanism that after somebody has manually reviewed an error that they can quickly create a Jira ticket. The next type of notifications that we offer are around sort of APM and paging systems. So this is like Datadog and PagerDuty. So again, if you have some other mechanism for notifying teams and managing who's on call and who's going to get notified, we can notify those systems instead. And then finally is the webhook notification type. So in this particular notification type, you stand up your own endpoint. For different types of notifications, we send you a particular fixed payload. So that the settings and the fields that are available in the payload are known for different types of notifications. And when I say different types of notifications, I mean if an error is seen for the first time, the payload will look a particular way. If an error is occurring at a particular high rate and you have a webhook integration set up there, the payload of the error will look slightly differently, but it will be known ahead of time, and then you can consume that payload that we send your endpoint, and then obviously you can have a very custom response. So it may be that you're extracting custom data that you've added to the error payload, let's say the ID of a feature flag, and you may want to then automatically turn off that feature flag. Or it may be that you want to notify back into Rollbar. So based on a webhook, maybe you want to assign the error to a particular person or the item to a particular person or a particular group of people. So if we can just one best practice around notifications, obviously, is if we can just move to the next slide there, is just some sort of a catch-all occurrence notification. And this would be specifically email, chat systems like Slack, is that have some mechanism. So one of the areas where we see some customers having difficulty is that errors are occurring at a high rate, but nobody really knows about it. So at a minimum, have some sort of a catch-all high occurrence notification. And in this here example here in the rule here I'm showing you here, it's debug and above. And if any particular item is occurring at more than 10,000 items within a 24-hour period, you're going to notify the Slack channel. Just one thing to be aware of, if you mute an item, it will never trigger a notification. So that may guide how you use the muting functionality, but just be aware of that. The other notification type that's available for higher tier plans is anomaly detection. So it isn't for a single item, it's just the pattern of occurrences within that Rollbar project. So we analyze the error data for the last few weeks, and we then know that, you know, Monday mornings may be a particularly quiet time for your application, and if errors are occurring at a high rate during that time window, that there's an anomaly and we can notify you. So that's another one we would recommend. And then finally, a new item notification. So the first time we see a particular item, the first time we see a fingerprint in the system, because we know that that error is new for that code base and has never been seen before, and that probably means that it's noteworthy and should at the very minimum be reviewed by someone on the team.
Yeah, and Finbar, if I can chime in there, the new item notification, if you take anything away, it's high occurrence rate of items, and in a brand new item. There's nothing better than deploying a piece of code and Rollbar detects that brand new error and you can solve it quickly. So I highly recommend this, because we see so often, as Finbar mentioned, projects just running up tremendous amount of errors and nobody's being notified. By default, when the project's created, we do create notifications for you. So go ahead and make sure you do use some of these good best practices for notifications.
So the next integration I want to talk about here is our service links. So what service links are is they're the ability to link out to other data in your ecosystem using data from the error occurrence or the item occurrence that you're currently viewing. So for those of you who may have delved into an item or an occurrence, you'll see that the data actually gets sent to the payload is structured JSON data, and it has a hierarchy, and the service links can be configured to extract information from that payload hierarchy to build up a URL to another system. And in the examples here I've shown below, maybe that you want to be able to have a button so that when you're triaging a particular item in Rollbar and you're looking at a particular occurrence, maybe you want to see all the open support tickets in your support system, in your Zendesk system, associated with the email address. Or it may be that you have a distributed system and you want to query Datadog for all the traces with that span ID and that trace ID. Or it may be that you're also logging your info and debug data to CloudWatch, and you have essentially a CloudWatch query URL that has a particular filter pattern that's going to give you all the error data or all the log data associated with that particular session ID. So Rollbar is notifying you that this error is new and interesting, and you can immediately then link out with a button on the screen within Rollbar to open CloudWatch filtered to see all the info debug data associated with that session ID. So you're not just using the data that you're sending to Rollbar to make a decision about the root cause or the business impact of an error. You're also linking out to the other data that you have available. So Nico, I'll hand it back to you here.
Perfect, thanks Finbar. So the next piece we want to cover is auto resolve. So one of the settings you will see in the Rollbar menu is auto resolve, and there's two options: on a deployment and when something is inactive. Now, the reason you want to use auto resolve is if you want to keep your Rollbar nice and clean, and I have to admit I'm one of those people who like to keep it clean and resolve my errors. There's nothing better than knowing that maybe a code deploy fixed an error, and you can then actually tell Rollbar, hey, if I'm deploying code, let's just mark everything as fixed. And some people say, look, I don't want to do that. You don't have to. You could say, let's get a bit smarter about that. What if this error doesn't happen for 10 days in a specific environment? We can then assume that this error has now been fixed. And you can go ahead and use either the on deploy or the inactive items to go ahead and do that. And it's a great way to make sure that the data you're viewing in your Rollbar list, if you're filtering it down, it is actually things that are occurring at the moment, real things you should be focusing on. So your list is nice and clean, and also these are real things affecting real people, and maybe not some legacy errors that may have happened 30, 40, 60 days ago and may no longer be occurring. So it's a great way to prune that list, keep it nice and clean. So highly recommend turning that on. And again, pick the environments that make the most sense. Sometimes in production, you just want to keep them there. But if you're in a test environment or QA, after the cycle or want to deploy, go ahead and clean out that list so you can get a brand new list for that specific test cycle you're doing, as an example of some of those environments. So highly recommend doing that as well. The next piece is symbol mapping. Finbar, I'll pop it back over to you.
Yep. So there are a few different ways that applications can give extra details about debug symbols and things like that. So I'm going to go through, sort of break it into two categories here. The first are JavaScript source maps, and then I'll talk about other symbol types. So to begin with, let's just talk about JavaScript source maps. So for performance reasons, you may be minifying your JavaScript code before you send it down to the client. And that means that the error data that gets sent to Rollbar contains minified JavaScript. Now, by default, we will assume that the map file has been deployed to the same directory as the JavaScript file or the minified JavaScript file. And if that website is publicly available, we will seek out that source map and download it from the publicly available web application. The benefit of this is that, you know, the source map, you may already be deploying it with the minified JS. You don't need to do anything extra to get Rollbar to be able to consume that. What problems which can occur is that something in that process of downloading that source map from your publicly available web app and processing it may not be done quickly enough for us Rollbar to include it in the fingerprinting process. So during the fingerprinting process, when an error is sent to Rollbar, if we see that it contains minified JS, we'll attempt to go out and download that map file. If it isn't available, we will not wait for it, and we will go ahead and fingerprint the error without the source map. So the preferred way, or the best practice recommendation, is that you have some process in your build pipeline that uploads the source maps ahead of time. So somewhere in your build process, you, for a particular version of your code, you upload the source maps to Rollbar. A new source map is needed, obviously, for each code version. So each version of your application will potentially have a different source map. So we will need the source map for each code version. You don't need to upload the source map for every domain you deploy to. So you may have a QA domain, a prod domain. You can upload the source map once. And if you configure your SDK appropriately, we'll be able to use the same source map for each. But you may find it more convenient just to upload it once for each environment. However, if you do deploy to many domains, so let's say you have vanity domains for your customer, so customer.rollbar.com, customer2.rollbar.com, you may not want to upload a source map for each one of those unique URLs. And again, you do have a mechanism within Rollbar to address that, so you just need to upload the source map once. The benefit, obviously, of uploading source maps ahead of time is that Rollbar will have processed the source map before the first error occurs, and it will be available so that we can include that in the fingerprinting process. Just an extra note, source maps can be a little tricky, but don't let that hold you back. Please try it and reach out to our support team if you have issues with it. There are just so many different ways to do it within JavaScript applications. There's so many different frameworks that sometimes you may just need a little bit of help to make sure that they're uploaded in the way that we can consume them. So I'm now going to move on to sort of other symbol types. So obviously, if you're deploying an application to a client device, you may not want to include detailed debug symbols in your build. So you'll be deploying some sort of a release build without debug symbols. And again, when the errors occur, that error data will get sent to Rollbar without the debug symbols, and we won't really be able to come back and determine what the file name, the method name, and the line number were. So again, in a similar way, you're going for each file, you're going to upload the source map, and you'll upload the appropriate symbol file, and you will upload that once per code version or once per binary. And again, by doing it before deployment, we will be able to include it in the fingerprinting process. So we can now move on here to the next section here. So yeah, so let's cover project SDK basics. So I do want to spend just a little bit of time on this call here just to go over the important settings within the SDK. So the first thing to be aware of is that initialization of Rollbar should be taking place as early as possible in the application lifecycle or in the lifecycle of a page, in the case of a JavaScript application, so that data related to startup problems get sent to Rollbar. As much as possible, standardize the initialization process. So make sure if it's feasible at all, so that different projects have at least some similar initialization settings, so that it's easier for people to move from one project to another, and to give information to, let's say, operations teams who may want certain data available across all projects that they have to support. Some of the important settings to include in the SDK, and they are all available. They may look different. The way it's done may be different depending on the language. But important settings would be, at a minimum, send us the environment name. So behind the scenes, we will give the same error in a different environment. We will treat it as a different item in Rollbar, so that when you see an item in Rollbar, it's only in the context of one environment. The benefit of doing this is that we will then be able to tell you that this error here is also occurring in another environment. But your notifications will obviously often be environment specific. You will care a lot more about errors, let's say, in your production environment. And by including the environment name, you can use it in that logic around your notification. The next thing would be to include the code version. So again, it's available in all SDKs. Have some mechanism to pass in, maybe as an environment variable or as a setting that's being read from some config file, what the code version of the application is. For generally, it's just going to be one thing for a particular code base, but in the case of client-server applications, you may have a client code version and a server code version. We do support you sending both within the same occurrence. The next one I would include here is the context property. So the context property is something you can tag an error with. You can do it maybe for all errors, make sure they all get sent with the same context, or in the case of a specific error. And where we'll see this often done is, let's say, the context will be tagged based on where in the code base the error is occurring, or where in the code base the first frame of the stack trace is, so that it can be assigned to the appropriate team. So they would use that context field to essentially decide which team owns the error when it arrives. That context property is an index search field. You can filter your items view timeline by the context value. You can do fast searches in Rollbar query language with the context, using the context as a filter, so do include it. The next thing, which many users of Rollbar maybe just aren't aware of, but you can add additional custom tags or custom fields to an error. And there are generally two reasons why you do that. One, for extra context to understand the root cause more easily, or else to understand the business impact. And it could be things like the cluster ID, the deployment region, the type of customer that's being impacted by the error. Maybe you're including your client ID in here, your customer IDs in there. And then the next section here is around data scrubbing. So if you have any policies internally about data scrubbing, do include that as part of your Rollbar configuration. And then the last one is around transforming the payload. And there are sort of two important events that you can intercept before an error gets sent to Rollbar. And the first one would be you can make a decision not to send a particular error to Rollbar, or you can also make a decision to modify the payload before it gets sent to Rollbar. So at a basic initialization step, this here is an example here in Python. So rollbar.init, all of our SDKs have something similar. So your access token, which gives you the ability for us that we will accept the error data from you based on the access token and assign it to the correct project. But at a minimum, include the environment and ideally the git commit number or the git commit SHA. And if you do that, there are benefits in terms of tying it back to the commits in your source control system, but it can also be a human readable release number. if that makes more sense. In this case here, this is a little method that I'm doing all my initialization. So I'm doing my basic rollbar initialization, and then I'm also defining a method that's going to be called just before the error gets sent to rollbar. And in that payload handler, I'm going to be able to modify. Maybe I'm going to do some very advanced data scrubbing. Maybe I'm going to tag in some additional custom tags just before I send it. Moving on now to the next slide here. So here's just an example here with JavaScript. So again, you can see the environment, the code version. In this case here, we're pulling in the person ID. So person is a reserved field in Rollbar, and you can filter your results. And by including the person ID, you can see which errors impacted that particular user. You can also track how many different users were impacted by an error. And then here we can see some of the custom fields being assigned. In the Java example on the right-hand side, the Java example, this here specifically is Spring Boot, but Java is very object-oriented. So each of these settings essentially is done in its own little class. So we're pulling in, we have a little person provider class to give us the person ID of the current context. A server provider to give the name of the server that this application is running on, and then a little class to modify the payload. Moving on, just a couple more examples here. Just the best practice across an organization. So ideally, include the Rollbar SDK in a library that's shared by all applications of a given language. So if let's say you have many Java applications, do include the Rollbar SDK in some library that's used by all of those. Moving on from that, we would recommend as a best practice to kind of override the Rollbar initialization so that you can consistently do required field initialization across all of your projects. So again, you can enforce that the environment and the code version is being sent. There may be specific custom fields that your operations team want available when they're reviewing errors. And then there may be some final catch-all data scrubbing that as an organization you may need by policy. And finally, just include the Rollbar initialization in your application template. So if you have an application template that is the starting point for all new services in your organization, do include the Rollbar initialization step in there. And to Nico's discussion earlier around notifying Rollbar when you do deployments, do include the instruction to notify Rollbar of a deployment in your deployment pipeline template. And then, this here is just an example here, a few different examples here of transforming the payload. And on the left-hand side, we see Python, where we're tagging some additional custom fields to the payload just before it gets sent. And on the right-hand side, in the Java payload transformer, we're actually, if there's a request object included in the error data, which there typically is in the case of Spring Boot, you can scrub maybe the authorization token and the host name so that isn't being sent to Rollbar.
Yeah, I think, Finbar, as you mentioned, as a best practice, it's a great way. If you ever want to do any sort of custom tagging or custom data that is consistent to you or means something to you, that helps. We've seen teams put in, how much memory was available, CPUs, graphic tools. Depending on the type of app you make, you could really use the transforming payload function to do exactly the things that will help you when you're looking at that error in Rollbar, get to the root cause of a problem a lot faster. So highly recommend using that.
Any of those additional tags can be used in custom fingerprint logic, in notification logic, based on custom data in the payload, either sending a notification or not sending it. And then obviously also in things like service links. So adding, let's say, session IDs and that type of thing so that you can query CloudWatch.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, let's jump into how do we scale this and automate projects with Rollbar. So there's a couple of ways to do this. You have the Rollbar API, and then, of course, we have a great thing called Terraform. Now, we have a tremendous amount of people that actually use Terraform today to automate Rollbar. And so what does this actually do? So Terraform is the ability to essentially script and create Rollbar Projects, you can go ahead and create, for example, a Terraform script that is your template of when you want a brand new Rollbar project to be created. What are some of the default settings, the things you want to set up in that brand new Rollbar project? So we highly recommend, once you know what you want and you start to use a lot more Rollbar projects in all your different teams, and you want to automate and create a standard across teams for setting up brand new projects, this is a great way to standardize them. We've also had customers that went and grew very quickly, and when they get to an IPO stage, they need to prove that they have some sort of standard for how they configure things and tools. And this was actually a great way of using Terraform to showcase how they have standardized their deployment and creation of Rollbar projects. Now, we do give you a bunch of standard script templates. And again, this is a great way to get started very quickly if you don't have a lot of experience with Terraform. And of course, the nice thing about these templates or using Terraform is you take a lot of the hard work and potential human errors out of creating these projects. So what are some of the examples we have with Terraform? So the first one is, how do I actually go ahead and install Terraform? But you can see at the top there, I can go ahead and install Terraform. And then a very basic thing like setting up my API key, my project API key, which is of course needed to do some of the things we want to automate. So a good example was, as we mentioned before, adding users and creating toolbars. So that front-end team, the back-end team, the QA team, the dev team, you can actually automate these with a Terraform script. So in this example, we have a front-end team. And then of course, we can go ahead and set, and assign this team to a specific project. The next thing we can do is then, well, what about notifications? We know the best practices we should be following. We maybe want to send things via email. We want to send things via Slack notification. And both of these examples, the first one, when a new item occurs, send an email. When a new item occurs, send a Slack message. And you can even pick the channel, what buttons. So all those config options you have to set up Slack is available via Terraform. So this is a very good example of how I can now start to automate some of these as templates. And then finally, if you want to do a webhook notification, you can even do webhook notifications via the Terraform provider. So this is, if you want to know how to scale and the best practice for deploying Rollbar for larger teams or teams that want to automate this as far as humanly possible, highly recommend you start to look at using Terraform for that. Now, we're getting close to the end of our time today, so I want to say thank you to everybody who's signed up for the webinar today and attended and listened to all the best practices we've got. So hopefully you were able to see some of the project basics, how you should be setting up Rollbar, some of the best practices for all of these items, and then finally, how can you automate this at scale using either the Rollbar API or the Terraform provider. And we're here to assist you, so if you do have any questions, feel free to ask anybody at Rollbar or use our support team, and we're happy to help you out with those questions. Now, we do have a Q&A session for those of you who do want to drop off early. Thank you very much for attending. But for those of you who do have some questions and would like to ask them, please go ahead and pop them into the chat, and we can start to answer those for you as well. Thank you again for attending today's webinar. Perfect. For those that are still in here, let's go ahead and look at some of the questions we've got over here. So thanks, Finba. I see you've got some of those.
So yeah, so the first question was around, can you mute a notification after a certain number of notifications? So one option, which isn't quite answering the question, but you can, it's like an exponential back off. So for the first 10th, 100th, and 1,000th occurrence, you could also do it via the API, that you can mute an error after, mute an item after a period of time or after certain notifications.
Yep, and for the final question, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel. So you should see the recorded YouTube video shortly, and we will be going ahead and emailing that link out to all the people that have registered for this webinar. And feel free to go ahead and share that with anybody on your team. So we'll absolutely be doing that within the next couple of days for you as well. Perfect. And I think we had people using it via some AWS Cloud Project Bootcamp. So that's great. Feel free to share that with the others that might be part of that as well. And if you are using some of the AWS tools, you will see that in that custom data, the payload, as Finbar mentioned, you can actually put a lot of those trace IDs, session IDs, all those payload items into Rollbar, and you will see immense value. As soon as you start to get these errors, it'll really pinpoint where the problems are. So highly recommend actually using that as you're setting up, for example, various containers or Lambda functions. Definitely use the Lambda SDK with Rollbar as well. It's a great way to actually use that and capture errors for some of those as well.
And just to kind of, again, one more comment on the custom tagging. So there is functionality coming that will allow you to get visibility into which combinations of fields, including custom fields, are associated with most occurrences. So it's helping you to pinpoint which combination of values in the error payloads for all the occurrences of an item are ones that are associated with most occurrences. So, that functionality is coming over the coming months, and by configuring these settings in your applications now or in your projects now, they'll be ready to take advantage of that coming functionality.
Absolutely. Perfect. Let's see if we have any other questions. I don't see any other questions. We'll give it a couple of minutes. If you do have a question, feel free to pop it in. We'll be hanging around for a couple more minutes. If not, feel free to drop off. And again, thank you for attending today's session. We hope you learned some of the best practices for Rollbar and you can implement those in your Rollbar projects. And we look forward to seeing how you get a lot more value out of getting some of these defaults set up and those working very well for your teams. So we'll be hanging around for a couple more minutes. Feel free to ask any questions you would like. Perfect. It looks like we don't have any more questions. So we'll go ahead and end this one right now. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a good rest of your day.